Hello everybody, and welcome back to a new video on my channel. The title of this video is Chagos Islands, How Britain Expelled Its Natives for a Military Base. If you are new to the channel, hello there, and be sure to stay and check my other videos. I usually upload on Sundays, and I talk about Black British history, that is any history about Black and other non-whites in the UK and the British Empire. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button and keep notified. Link to my PayPal is in the description. Chagos Islands is an archipelago located in the Indian Ocean. It was first discovered by the Maldivian people. According to early oral tradition of the Maldives, local traders and fishermen became occasionally lost at sea and were stranded in one of the islands of the Chagos. Eventually, they were rescued and brought back home, but the islands were considered to be too far from the Maldives. And for many centuries, the Chagos Islands were ignored by the Maldives. But in reality, the Maldives are not so far from the Chagos Islands and are actually the nearest country to them. In Maldivian oral tradition, the Chagos Islands as a whole is called Feihandhib, and according to Maldivian history, the Maldivian archipelago consists of Mahaldhib, which is how you say the Maldives, Sufadhibu, which is a southern part of the Maldivian islands, and Feihandhib. In the 16th century, the Portuguese were the first Europeans to discover the archipelago. The Portuguese navigator Pedro de Mascarenhas was the first person to encounter the islands on his 1512 to 1513 voyage, although some researchers believe that the encounter happened in 1532 or later. Portuguese sailors named the islands Baças de Chagos. Chagos means wounds in Portuguese and was meant to refer to the holy wounds of the crucifixion of Jesus. Diego Garcia was named by the sailors, as well as Pedro's Baños, although it was originally called Pedro dos Baños, literally meaning Pedro of the Baths, as mentioned by Alfonso Albuquerque, a general known for conquering Goa in India. However, the Portuguese were not interested in integrating the islands group as part of the Portuguese Empire, as they saw no benefit economically and politically, and as a result they left the islands. It is situated halfway between Tanzania and Indonesia, and comprises 7 islands, or atolls. Currently, it is a quote-unquote British overseas territory, meaning that the set of islands is under the complete control of the British and was renamed to British Indian Ocean Territory. It is administered by the Commissioner of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Its flag, adopted in 1990, is described as a blue ensign with 7 wavy white stripes, with a palm tree on the hoist side and a crown over it. It is different from the flag used by native Chagossians themselves, where the colours sit horizontally, mostly orange, thinly black, and then some blue at the bottom. Diego Garcia is the biggest island and the southernmost one, and is the only island being used for military purposes, an air and naval base to be specific. About 95% of the population are either British or American, and the rest are other nationalities. However, none of them are Chagossians. To add to this, there is no permanent civilian population on the islands. About 4,000 US and British military contract civilian personnel are stationed there. Your wonders probably now lead you to think, well, who are the Chagossians? The Chagossians are an African ethnic group who were brought to the islands from mainly Mauritius as enslaved peoples under the French in 1786. They were all expelled by the British from the islands by 1973 to build British and US military bases, most of them being exiled to Mauritius, Seychelles and the UK. The Chagossians speak Chagossian Creole, a French-based Creole, also known as Ilois Creole, and is still spoken to some extent by the descendants in Mauritius and Seychelles, but Chagossians living in the UK speak English. The ancestry of the Chagossians are mainly Mauritian, Mozambican and Madagascan, and to a smaller extent Indian and Malay. the French captured some Africans from those countries and brought them to the Chagos Islands, enslaving them, establishing coconut plantations. Diego Garcia being its first colony. At the time, the Indian Ocean and its African, Arab and Indian coasts were an epicenter of heightened competition between the British, French and Dutch for dominance over the spice trade and routes to India and East Asia. The French had already colonized Réunion, which was then called Isle Bourbon, in 1649. They also claimed Mauritius, which was then called Isle de France, in 1721. Subsequently, they took over the Seychelles and the Chagos Islands. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain captured Mauritius and Réunion from the French, but gave back Réunion under the 1814 Treaty of Paris. However, Mauritius as well as Seychelles and the Chagos Islands, the two latter island groups being dependencies of Mauritius, were kept under their control. The British continued to enslave the Chagossians until the British slave trade was abolished in 1834. But businesses by the British were being built there, where Seychellois, Mauritian, Somali, Chinese, Malay and Indian workers were employed there. The Chagos Islands and Seychelles were administered from Mauritius under British control. On August 31st, 1903, Seychelles was separated, but the Chagos Islands still remains attached to Mauritius. In 1965, Mauritius was a self-governing colony, and the UK detached the Chagos Islands from Mauritius and renamed the archipelago British Indian Ocean Territory. So why was this decision made? In short, it was to use Diego Garcia for military purposes. But how did this move come about? In the 1930s, Father de Sucre, a priest for the British Army on Chagos, said that 60% of the plantation workers were children of the island, quote unquote, a dehumanizing phrase to refer to the Chagossians. However, in 1962, a British company called Chagos Archipelago started employing exclusively Seychellois workers, as well as a few from mainland Mauritius, causing some natives to leave Chagos. Around 1964, the US and the UK were beginning talks about a possible US military base. The expulsions began in 1965. People were herded into the hold of a rusting ship, the women and children forced to sleep on a cargo of bird fertilizer. One such case showed that a group of Chagossians were dumped in the Seychelles, where they were held in prison cells and then shipped on to Mauritius, where they were taken to a derelict housing estate with no electricity or water. 26 families died there in brutal poverty, 9 individuals committed suicide, and girls were forced into prostitution to survive. The British Colonial Office recommended detaching Chagos from Mauritius. In early 1965, the US Embassy in London also requested this. On November 8, 1965, the UK quote-unquote created the British Indian Ocean Territory by order of council. On December 30th, 1966, the US signed a 50-year agreement to use Chagos for military purposes. However, 57 years later, the islands are still being used for military purposes. This is because of a 20-year extension agreement in 2016. But let's talk about what happened after the initial agreement. Expulsion and quote-unquote voluntary emigration of the Chagossians increased in 1968. The same year, Mauritius gained independence from the British. A year later, the British Indian Ocean Territory Administration had bought out Chagos Archipelago, the British company I mentioned earlier, for $600,000, which then made Chagos Archipelago the sole property owners of Chagos. However, the company terminated the lease in the same year and incorporated themselves into the Seychelles as Mulini and Company Limited. The administration's plan was to deprive Chagossians as much as possible so they could end up leaving the islands quote-unquote voluntarily. According to communication between British government officials, the primary objective in acquiring these islands was to ensure that Her Majesty's government had full title to and control over these islands so that they could be used for the construction of defence facilities without hydrants or political agitation, so that when a particular island would be needed for the construction of British or United States defense facilities, Britain or the United States should be able to clear it of its current population. A memo of the Colonial Office said that the Chagossians were not quote-unquote permanent inhabitants and were quote-unquote belongers to Mauritius and Seychelles, and only quote-unquote temporary residents of the British Indian Ocean Territory. Chagossian human rights activists, as well as Mauritian human rights lawyers, accused the British of undercounting the number of Chagossians. Evidence points to the fact that the then governor of Mauritius in 1965 said that there were 1,700 Chagossians, but in a report by the British Indian Ocean Territory in 1968, the British government said that only 354 Chagossians were third-generation quote-unquote belongers to Chagos. From March 1969, Chagossians visiting Mauritius were no longer allowed to the islands. They were also told that their contracts on Diego Garcia had expired. Relatives who also sought missing family members in Mauritius were unable to return. More than 1,000 dogs in Chagos were gassed and killed in front of Chagossians. In April 1971, John Rawlin Todd, a British colonial civil servant, told the last few inhabitants that they would be forced to leave. In 1972, the remaining population were forced on ships to migrate to Mauritius and Seychelles. Those who chose the Seychelles were soon afterwards compensated. The British government also sent £650,000 of quote-unquote compensation for 426 families who were displaced to Mauritius, to the Mauritian government. But the Mauritian government withheld that compensation until 1977. Some have since migrated to the UK. Since then, the exiled Chagossian community have been fighting to be permitted to return to the islands, with the Mauritian government backing this return, claiming that the Chagos Islands are theirs. As well as Chagossians and the Mauritian government, Mauritian lawyers and human rights organisations have condemned the UK's and US's actions on Chagos Islands. Let's bring out a timeline on what has happened since the expulsion. The UK Chagos Support Association, an organisation that is no longer active as of 2022, set out a timeline on their website. To repeat what I said earlier, only Diego Garcia is being used for military purposes, despite the UK claiming all of the islands. Now let's go back to 1963, where we also focus on some details I haven't mentioned yet. In 1963, the USA asked the UK to find an uninhabited island where the US could build a naval base. This was due to the US's concern about a possible Soviet expansion in the Indian Ocean. In return, the US said it was willing to waive up to $14 million in research and development fees related to Britain's Polaris missile program. Originally, the US wanted to establish their base on the island of Aldabra, north of Madagascar. However, the island is a breeding ground for rare giant tortoises whose mating habits would have been disturbed by military activities. The US fears that ecologists would expose their activities, so they changed their minds to Diego Garcia. Fast forward to 1965, Sir Bruce Greatbatch, the British colonial governor of the Seychelles, said that the USA made depopulation of the Chagos Islands virtually a condition, in quotation marks. When he described the Chagossians, he said that they have little aptitude for anything other than growing coconuts, and commented that they are unsophisticated and untrainable. British Colonial General Secretary Anthony Greenwood said that the eviction of Chagossians must be presented to the UN with a fait accompli, which means something that has already been done and can't be changed. He also travelled to Mauritius to negotiate independence, but said that the UK will retain Chagos when Mauritius becomes independent. In November, a telegram sent to the UK mission of the UN showed that the UK and US were aware that Chagos had permanent residents. It said, "We recognise we are in a difficult position as regards references to people at present on the detached islands. We know a few were born in Diego Garcia and perhaps some of the other islands, and so were their parents before them. We cannot therefore assert that there are no permanent inhabitants. However, much this would have been to our advantage. In these circumstances, we think it would be best to avoid all references to permanent inhabitants. Once again in the same month, Prime Minister Harold Wilson insisted that the UK will retain Chagos after Mauritian independence. It was on November 8th when Chagos was separated from Mauritius to become the British Indian Ocean Territory. In January, a British Foreign Office official wrote, converting all the existing residents of the Chagos Islands into short-term temporary residents in order to justify their removal to make room for US naval facilities planned for the island of Diego Garcia. In August, Sir Paul Gore Booth, a senior officer at the Foreign Office, wrote to British diplomat Dennis Greenhill saying, the object of the exercise is to get some rocks which will remain ours. There will be no indigenous population except seagulls. The United States government will require the removal of the entire population of the atoll by July. In his reply, Greenhill said, unfortunately, along with the birds go some few Tarzans or Man Fridays whose origins are obscure and who are hopefully being wished onto Mauritius. An unnamed British official suggested reclassifying Chagossians as a floating population and making up the rules as we go along in quotation marks in a memo titled Maintaining the Fiction. On December 30th, the US and the UK came to a 50-year agreement over the British Indian Ocean Territory, which was extended by 20 years in 2016. On two separate voyages, plantation workers and residents left the Chagos Islands on Mauritius, a ship operated by Rogers & Co. to Port Louis, Mauritius's capital. Many of the passengers were going to Mauritius only temporarily and intended to return to the island. But when they tried to return to the Chagos Islands in 1968, they were refused passage and told that they would not be permitted to return to their islands. The islanders were thus left stranded in Mauritius without resettlement, assistance or compensation. Oliver Bancolt later recounts to the BBC how his 11-member family went to Mauritius in 1968 so that his ill sister could see a doctor. After she died, family members tried to return to the islands, but were told the land had been given to the Americans for a US military base. Ships carrying food and medicine to Diego Garcia were turned back. These measures were taken with the knowledge of British Prime Minister Harold Wilson and his Conservative successor, Edward Heath. Foreign Secretary Michael Stewart wrote that by any stretch of the English language, there was an indigenous population and the Foreign Office knew it. Later in July, the US said it will build facilities on Diego Garcia. Foreign Secretary Michael Stewart wrote to Harold Wilson that Parliament and US Congress were not informed of the $14 million waived associated with the UK's Polaris submarine programme. In April, the British government approved plans for evacuation of Chagos and agreed to mislead the UN over the Diego Garcia resettlement, in quotation marks, by presenting any move as a change of employment for contract workers rather than as a population resettlement. 5 days later, Harold Wilson approved of this. In December, the US Congress approved plans for Diego Garcia. Well, as I was making the script, the Chagos support website literally expired. On my computer, it said that the website closed the connection, and when I also went to check the same website on my phone, it said the same thing. So I'm a bit annoyed, but don't worry, I found other sources to complete my timeline. So where were we up to? Construction of the military base began in Diego Garcia, and John Rawlin Todd, a British colonial civil servant, told the last few inhabitants that they will be forced to leave. Sir Bruce Greatbatch, the British Indian Ocean Territory Commissioner and Governor of the Seychelles enacted an immigration ordinance that made it unlawful for any person to enter or remain in the Chagos Archipelago without a permit. This law did not apply to members of the British Armed Forces or UK government officials. He ordered all the dogs on Diego Garcia to be killed, an order that was carried out by company manager Marcel Mulini. Mulini described later how he first tried shooting the dogs, then poisoning them. Eventually, more than 1,000 dogs, including pets, were gassed with exhaust fumes from pipes attached to the exhaust pipes of US military vehicles. This was done as a tactic to make Chagossians leave. Later in the year, a ship came from the Seychelles to Diego Garcia to take the inhabitants away. It took some of the islanders to Salomon and Perros Banhos before, quotation marks, limping with engine trouble to Mahe on the Seychelles. The Isle of Farquhar, a ship belonging to Mulini and Co., was chartered the same year by the British Indian Ocean Territory government, arriving in Diego Garcia early in September and then sailing to Perros Banhos and Salomon with Chagossian families. Chagossians taken to those islands remained there for another 2 years, but life for them was horrible. Due to the British administration and Mulini and Co., milk supplies ran out, and women fed children a mixture of coconut milk and sugar instead. Chagossians that were taken to Mahe were forced to live in an unused part of a prison for 8 days until another boat arrived to take them to Mauritius. The British government sent £650,000 of quote-unquote compensation to 426 displaced families to the Mauritian government, but the Mauritian government withheld that compensation until 1978. The delay in compensation was considered unacceptable by many Chagossians. As a result, Michel Vincatesin, ordered by Gaetan Duval, the head of the Creole Party in Mauritius, filed suit against the United Kingdom for additional compensation. The UK pressured the Mauritian government to pay out the 1972 compensation, in which it finally did in 1978. The final removal of Chagossians happened when the ship came on May 26 and deported them to Mauritius via the Seychelles. The ship arrived on June 13, 1973, with 8 men, 9 women, and 47 children. They were the last of the population removed from Chagos, and the plantations closed. The conditions on the boat weren't good, as they were forced to the bottom of the boat, like animals, in quotation marks. Ironically, horses that were rescued from Diego Garcia were placed at the top of the deck. One woman on the boat, Lisby Elise, who was pregnant and from Perros Banhos, described her experience on the ship. She said, "The condition of our evacuation was terrible. We shared the cabin with animals like pigs and horses. People fell sick. There were no toilets, so we defecated in the same room. I saw 2 people die on the boat and their bodies were thrown into the sea. They weren't people I knew personally, but they only got on the boat when we stopped in Seychelles." 2 weeks later, after arriving in Mauritius, she miscarried because of the trauma. She said she was really sick when she was below deck for several days. Many Chagossians were forced to live in extreme poverty and extreme hunger, which led to the deaths of family members. Company staff had lied to them, saying there would be houses and work waiting for them in Mauritius. Rosemond Saminden, who had been forced to leave Perros Banhos in 1973, said that the captain was so distressed by the conditions and that he threatened to take them right back to Perros Banhos because he had never been involved in transporting people who had nowhere to go. He allowed everyone to stay in the boat and sleep in the harbour for 3 days. Paul Mulini, the plantation company owner, was the only one who gave Rosamond and everyone else 10 Mauritian rupees or $1.84 when he visited them in the docks. Furthermore, Samin Naden said, immigration officials then offered us an uncompleted, abandoned estate occupied by animals. We refused this, and then they took us to the dock workers' estate where we lived for 15 years. It was only slightly better than the cow shed. It was 1 bedroom for my entire family to live in, but it was rent-free and we had no money. Chagossians suffered from xenophobia, and therefore their needs were not prioritized. They found it hard to find employment from the governments of Mauritius and the Seychelles. David Vine, a professor of political anthropology, studied the Chagossians for multiple years, described how many of them died at a young age, with one group recording that 44 of them died in 1975, quote-unquote, because of happiness, poverty, and a lack of medical care, with at least 11 more committing suicide. Another report said that by 1975, 1 in 4 Chagossians in Mauritius had died of starvation and disease. In the meantime, the first media coverage of the expulsion of Chagossians reached the Washington Post, with David Ottaway titling an article, "Islanders Were Evicted for US Base," and talked about the situation in full detail. In response, 2 US congressional committees looked further into the matter, as they were told that the subject of Diego Garcia was meant to be classified. The Sunday Times also published an article titled "The Islanders That Britain Sold." The same year, a Methodist preacher from Kent, George Champion, changed his name to George Chagos and began a one-man picket in front of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office with a placard that read Diego Garcia in caps. He continued to do this until his death in 1982. What I didn't mention before is that there were more than the Chagos Islands that was incorporated into the British Indian Ocean Territory. These were lands that were the dependencies of Seychelles. The Aldabra, as I previously mentioned, as the island that breeds turtles, was incorporated, as well as Desroches and Farquhar Islands. As Seychelles achieved independence in that year, those islands also ceded to the young country. This was the year that the Mauritian government finally began to compensate Chagossians. The Mauritian government published a list containing 557 Illawarra families, totaling 2,323 people, as eligible for compensation. Later, in 1978, the Mauritian government reported that 2,365 Illawarra had received compensation, 1,081 adults and 1,284 minor children. In the same year, 6 Chagossian women went on a hunger strike in Bain des Dames, a town in Port Louis, Mauritius. This happened in September, where women from Lalit, a left-wing political party, although at the time it was a tendency part of the Mauritian militant movement, another political party, before it split in 1981, and Mouvement Libération Femmes, or Women's Liberation Movement, held an all-night solidarity event to mobilize support for the hunger strike. This hunger strike helped the question of Diego Garcia to become central on the national political agenda and central for the women's liberation movement. The woman-led struggle against militarism and colonization of the Chagos intensified in that year. In March, another hunger strike involving 8 women was held in front of the British High Commission in Port Louis. On the 9th day of the strike, where the media had still not reported on the matter, Mouvement Libération Femmes took the formal decision to meet the delegation of the women coordinating the strike. It was decided that a women's demonstration would be held the following day at 11:30 a.m. This is what exactly happened. 50 to 60 Chagossian women, together with the militants of Mouvement Libération Femmes and Lalit, distributed paper banners, hid them inside clothes, and when the right moment came, they pulled out banners and took out riot police by surprise. The women chanted, "What do we want, Diego? Close down the base and get out." And the protest provoked public opinion, as many Mauritians didn't even know what had happened to the Chagossian people. This demonstration went on for 2 days. On the 3rd day, where cabinet ministers would meet, 100 to 200 women took over the street in front of Parliament, just in front of the statue of Queen Victoria, shouting the platform demands. Riot police tried to attack the women, and when this happened, the women came up with a new tactic that was grabbing the weakest point of all the riot police, all men, and squeezing as hard as possible. At this point, the riot police were disassembled, and the women used this opportunity to whack their heads with umbrellas. It didn't take long until other people got involved to defend the women, whether Chagossian or non-Chagossian, which ultimately led to the riot police conceding defeat. The demonstration was followed by a court case involving the striking women who were charged under the Public Order Act, but they won the case. These series of protests and strikes led to the UK paying £4 million in compensation. Chagossians received a few £1,000s per recipient. However, the USA spent hundreds of millions on expanding the Diego Garcia base. The Chagos refugee group was founded in Port Louis, a voluntary community-led organization that works to support many aspects of their people's needs, from immigration and community support to protecting and promoting our culture and heritage. There is not much information from that point until 2000, when a British High Court ruling was made which granted Chagossians the right to return back to the island. However, even then, the UK government, through the British Indian Ocean Territory Administration, commissioned a quote-unquote feasibility study in 2002, indicating while it may be feasible to resettle the islanders in the short term, the costs of maintaining a long-term inhibition were likely to be prohibitive. Even in the short term, natural events such as periodic flooding from storms to seismic activity were likely to make life difficult for a resettled population. In 2004, Queen Elizabeth II, acting on behalf of the UK government, issued two quote-unquote orders in council, declaring that no one had the right to live in British Indian Ocean Territory or enter and remain there without authorization, overturning the 2000 decision. Also in 2002, some Chagossians living in Mauritius and Seychelles migrated to the UK after the government announced the granting of British citizenship to the Chagossians, following the passing of the British Overseas Territories Act 2002. Just like in Mauritius and also in the Seychelles, they are discriminated against in the UK. A year earlier, three Chagossian activists, Olivia Banco, who is the head of the Chagos refugee group, Therese Main, and Marie-Isabelle France Charlot, sued the US government in an unsuccessful case for forced relocation and accused them of quote-unquote trespass, intentional infliction of emotional distress, forced relocation, racial discrimination, torture, and genocide. As the islanders' case was dismissed, back in the UK on May 11th, the British High Court ruled that the expulsion of Chagossians from their homeland was unlawful, where Olivia Banco was the claimant and the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs was the defendant. This also meant Chagossians were permitted to return to the islands. The government appealed twice against the ruling. The first time they did so was on May 23, 2007. They took the case to the Court of Appeal, and the government's case was dismissed. Lord Justice Sedley, given the head ruling, said the government's use of the order in council under the royal prerogative, powers that allow action without reference to Parliament, was an unlawful way of preventing the islanders from returning. The UK Chagos Support Association welcomed the court's decision and also urged the government not to appeal again. Chairman Robert Bain said, "The government knows the Chagossians have no independent means to resettle the islands. To accept the islanders' rights to return, but do nothing about it, as it did between 2000 and 2004, would be meaningless and immoral." However, the tables turned when the government appealed for the second time on October 22, 2008, and won when the House of Lords overturned the 2006 ruling. Once again, Chagossian activists were back to square one, not being allowed to return to their native land. In December 2010, WikiLeaks leaked a diplomatic cable dating back to 2009 that exposed plans to create a quote-unquote marine protected area for Chagos, a decision that was ultimately enforced by the British government in April 2010. The cable had shown the reason for this decision, agreed by UK and US officials, which was to prevent Chagossians from going home. The summary of the cable said, Her Majesty's government would like to establish a marine park, quote-unquote, or, quote-unquote, reserve, providing comprehensive environmental protection to the reefs and waters of the British Indian Ocean Territory. A senior Foreign and Commonwealth Office official informed Polkins on May 12th. The official insisted that the establishment of a marine park, the world's largest, would in no way impinge on USG use of the British Indian Ocean Territory, including Diego Garcia, for military purposes. He agreed that the UK and US should carefully negotiate the details of the Marine Reserve to assure that US interests were safeguarded and the strategic value of British Indian Ocean Territory was upheld. He said that the British Indian Ocean Territory's former inhabitants would find it difficult, if not impossible, to pursue their claim for resettlement on the islands if the entire Chagos Archipelago were a marine reserve. In March, the now defunct petitioning system of the whitehouse.gov website, We the People, launched an international petition asking the US government to acknowledge their wrongdoings against the Chagossians. The petition read, "The US government must redress wrongs against the Chagossians. For generations, the Chagossians lived on the Chagos Archipelago in the Indian Ocean, but in the 1960s, the UK and the US governments expelled the Chagossians from their homes to allow the US to build a military base on Diego Garcia. Facing social, cultural, and economic despair, the Chagossians now live as a marginalized community in Mauritius and Seychelles and have not been allowed to return home. The recent passing of the oldest member of the exiled population underscores the urgent need to improve the human rights of the Chagossians. We cannot let others die without the opportunity to return home and obtain redress. The United States should provide relief to the Chagossians in the form of resettlement to the outer Chagos Islands, employment and compensation." The petition met the required 25,000 signatures a month later, which triggered a response by the US Department of State. The response read, "Thank you for your petitioning regarding the inhabitants of the Chagos Archipelago. The US recognizes the British Indian Ocean territories, including the Chagos Archipelago, as the sovereign territory of the UK. The US appreciates the difficulties intrinsic to the issues raised by the Chagossian community. In the decades following the resettlement of Chagossians in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the United Kingdom has taken numerous steps to compensate former inhabitants of the hardships they endured, including cash payments and eligibility for British citizenship. The opportunity to become a British citizen has been accepted by approximately 1,000 individuals now living in the UK. Today, the US understands that the UK remains actively engaged with the Chagos community. Senior officials from the UK continue to meet with Chagossian leaders. Community trips to the Chagos Archipelago are organised and paid for by the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom provides support for community projects within the United Kingdom and Mauritius, to include a resource centre in Mauritius. The United States supports these efforts and the UK's continued engagement with the Chagossian community. Thank you for taking the time to raise this important issue with us." In 2012, the European Court of Human Rights rejected the request of Chagossians who made an application for a trial ruling before the court. In 2005, 1,785 Chagossians stated in their application that the UK violated their rights under the European Convention of Human Rights under Article 3, the prohibition against degrading treatment, Article 6, the right to a fair trial, Article 8, the right to privacy in one's home, Article 13, the right to obtain remedy before national courts, and Protocol 1, Article 1, the right to peaceful enjoyment of one's possessions. On December 11th, the European Court of Human Rights said that the British Indian Ocean Territory did not come under jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, and that all claims had been raised and settled in British courts. In March, the UN Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled that the UK acted illegally in creating the quote-unquote marine protected area. This was after Mauritius sued the UK under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea to challenge the validity of the marine protected area in December 2010. Mauritius considered that the UK not being a quote-unquote coastal state under UN clause and international law had no authority to purport to establish a marine protected area around the Chagos Archipelago. The case was dealt with in the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the court that deals with international disputes between member states, international organizations, and private parties. The case went on for 5 years. On March 18, 2015, it was concluded that the Chagos Marine Protected Area was quote-unquote, not in accordance with the provisions of the Convention, and declared unanimously that in establishing the MPA surrounding the Chagos Archipelago, the United Kingdom had breached its obligations under Articles 2, bracket 3, 56, bracket 2, and 194, bracket 4 of the Convention. In November, the Foreign Office confirmed that the Chagos Islands will not be permitted to return to their homeland. 2016 was supposed to mark the year of the ending of a 50-year lease to use Diego Garcia for military purposes. But the Foreign Office Minister, Baroness Joyce Annelay, said that the government had decided against allowing the Chagossians to go home on the grounds of quote-unquote feasibility, defence and security interests, and to the cost of the British taxpayer. She also said there will be a £40 million support package over the next decade to help exile islanders to improve their lives. The government has also considered the interaction of any potential community with the US Naval Support Facility, a vital part of our defence relationship. The manner in which the Chagossian community was removed from the territory in the 1960s and 1970s, and the way they were treated was wrong, and we look back with deep regret. As she looked back with alleged deep regret, the lease was extended by a further 20 years, granted to the US to use the military base on Diego Garcia. In response, the Chagos refugee group refused the $40 million package and attempt to get them to drop their demand to go home. The United Nations General Assembly voted 94-15 in favor of referring Chagos legal status to the International Court of Justice. In response to this, the spokesperson for the Foreign Office said, "This is a disappointing outcome. Sovereignty of the British Indian Ocean Territory is clearly a matter for the UK and Mauritius to resolve ourselves. Taking this dispute to the International Court of Justice is an inappropriate use of the ICJ mechanism." In September 2018, the International Court of Justice heard arguments in the case of whether UK violated Mauritian sovereignty when it took possession of the Chagos Islands for its own military interests. On February 25, 2019, the ICJ ruled that the UK violated the right to self-determination of the Chagossians and was obliged to end its control of the archipelago. In May, the UN General Assembly welcomed the ruling of the resolution for the UK to withdraw control of the islands, was passed by a vote of 116 in favour, 6 against, and 56 abstentions. In January, even so, the prominent human rights boards had declared their rulings. The UK still refused to accept this. Just 12 months later, from the UK's refusal, the panel of the judges at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea criticised the UK's failure to hand the territory to Mauritius, declaring that the UK had no sovereignty over the Chagos Islands. Mauritius Prime Minister Pravind Jugnauth told BBC, "The judgment is clear and unequivocal. Mauritius is sovereign over the Chagos Archipelago." 2022. In February, 5 Chagossians arrived on the beach of Peros Banhos. In February, 5 Chagossians arrived on the beach of Peros Banhos on a motor, where they kissed the sand and stood with hands joined together in thanksgiving prayers. There stood Olivia Bancolt, Lisby Elise, Marie Suzelle Baptiste, Rosamond Bertin, and Marcel Humbert. They did so without the monitoring of British officials. All 5 of them wore T-shirts that said "Chagos my home" and "Everyone has a right to live in his birthplace." This visit was organised by the Mauritian government. Pravind Jugnauth told The Guardian in a telephone call that this was, quote-unquote, not in any way a hostile act and was not meant to embarrass the UK. Quote-unquote, "It is merely an exercise of our sovereignty over part of our territory, and that is in accordance with the international law." The Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in London said, Successive UK governments have expressed sincere regret about the manner in which Chagossians were removed from British Indian Ocean Territory in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and we are currently delivering a £40 million support package to Chagossians over a 10-year period. In October, the UK and Mauritius agreed to have talks regarding Mauritian sovereignty over the islands in New York, between the Prime Ministers Liz Truss and Juggernauth. Chagossians, however, opposed the talks because they were not included in them. In January, Bernadette Dugas, a Chagossian activist, began legal proceedings against the British government, seeking a judicial review of the government's approach to the talks, quote unquote, so that the former residents and their families are properly consulted with respect to the negotiations on the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands. Some Chagossians also demanded for a referendum on this matter. In September, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson argued that handing the Chagos to Mauritius would be a quote-unquote colossal mistake. In October, a paper by 3 legal academics, part of a think tank, including a foreword by the Admiral, the Lord of West Spithead, yes, you heard that right, also opposed the handing of Chagos to Mauritius. He stated that it would be a major self-inflicted blow, quote-unquote, with the think tank stating that such a decision would threaten the Falklands. On December the 1st, it was reported that the UK would plan to discontinue the talks. Which leads us to the conclusion. On the one hand, many things have changed. Thanks to the Chagossians, the situation at hand was brought to national attention in Mauritius. It was also finally brought to international attention, where international human rights organisations declare the actions of the UK and USA to be unlawful. British courts have gone back and forth with their rulings. On the other hand, Chagossians are still not permitted to go back to their homeland. Chagossian activists have not stopped fighting, and they never will until they get the land back. Will they have to wait until 2036 or get their land back sooner? And what if the British court grants the US an extension again? These are all important questions yet to be answered.